day with some great panels and presentations and some great speakers and plenty of breaks. So here is the first of the great speakers for the day. Molly Gray was elected Vermont's Lieutenant Governor just 1 year ago. Lieutenant Governor Gray's roots are in rural Vermont. She grew up on her family farm in Newbury, and she describes herself as a proud product of Vermont's education system that includes UVM and Vermont Law School. And over the last few months, the Lieutenant Governor has traveled to communities throughout Vermont as part of her Recover Stronger tour, gathering experiences, concerns, ideas from our fellow Vermonters about how to recover stronger from COVID-19. And since some of those same issues and concerns guided the planning for this conference, we're doubly glad and honored to have her with us this morning. If you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end of the Lieutenant Governor's remarks. But Lieutenant Governor Gray, welcome. We're so glad you're with us today and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. I hope it's a wonderful Friday wherever you are Zooming in from across the Northeast Kingdom, but I think there's some folks here from across Vermont. It's a real pleasure to join you, and especially because of the focus of your work today and the topics around recovery. And when I think about recovery and when I think about what I've heard from Vermonters all summer long, and I'm talking from Bennington and Brattleboro up to Newport and St. Albans and everywhere in between, there's a feeling of from crisis comes opportunity. And I know that's a hard thing to say, given the case counts, given the challenges that we're still facing in this pandemic. And I don't want to shortchange those issues, which we continue to need to focus on every single day. But we're in a pretty historic moment for Vermont. And I want to talk about that historic moment and some of the things that I see, but really some of the things, most of the things that I've heard from Vermonters all summer long about what we should be investing in. So first, I guess the underlying question or challenge, opportunity, where are we at as a state? As many of the folks here know, we do have a demographic crisis in Vermont. We see more lights off than lights on in a lot of communities, and this was true before the pandemic. We've seen more deaths than births in a majority of Vermont counties. I think Chittenden County, Franklin County, pieces of Grand Isle, and maybe a little bit of Lamoille are an exception. Obviously, we've seen a lot of folks move to Vermont, which we should welcome, but we have pretty prolific and profound workforce development challenges. Anyone trying to go to a restaurant right now or find a line cook or find an electrician or a plumber or a home care provider or a nurse, you name it, we have massive workforce shortages. We also have a massive housing crisis, from trying to find homes for or housing for housing insecure Vermonters all the way along the spectrum, from rental housing to housing for working families and housing for some of our older Vermonters who may want to move out of, like my folks at some point, I suspect, move out of an old farmhouse and into a accessible, safe, weatherized, single-story home. And so to meet those housing challenges, we really have to think beyond this moment and how we're going to invest the money coming to Vermont. But what I want to recognize is that we had some pretty big challenges before the pandemic, broadband being another, a lack of access to the internet. And then the pandemic really just put the foot on the gas, or if we can think of all the metaphors or different examples, but accelerated what we already knew to be true, and particularly accelerated what we knew to be true in rural communities, in Newbury, where I grew up, in the Northeast Kingdom for sure, but also in Southern Vermont. Less so, I would say, in some of our more populated areas around Burlington and Chittenden County. And so what is our moment, right? Amongst all of these challenges that we have, this crisis that we have, what is our moment? And that is the question that I've been continuing to grapple with. But I think our moment is this. We have $2.7 billion coming to the state through the American Rescue Plan Act. And if anyone's looked at the sort of guardrails or buckets around that funding, it's set up in different areas. There's money for municipalities, and we can talk about what it means to make sure that state money and municipality money line up to support particular projects if you want. There's buckets for broadband, which is good, and we need that. There's buckets for housing. There's some buckets for childcare, but the parameters are pretty broadly defined. So this legislative session, there's a lot of space to figure out how do we define those buckets to really meet the needs in Vermont. We also know that in the last, I think it was last weekend, the bipartisan infrastructure deal passed Congress, and there's at least 100 million in there for broadband, but and for wastewater and sewer, a lot of the infrastructure needs necessary to help housing development, a lot of support for different projects across the state, sort of the traditional bridges and roads. But then there's also the Build Back Better agenda, which is our human infrastructure, childcare, hopefully paid family and medical leave. My goodness, we need it. Investments in climate and making Vermont more climate resilient. So I think never before in our history have we had so much room to make investments. But our challenge is really how do we align the needs that we have here in Vermont, and when we identify those needs, making sure that everyone who is working in our communities and has an understanding of those needs has a seat at the table and a voice in the process. But aligning the budget that we have, the investments, the money that we have with the needs that we have, so that we start to address some of the systemic issues that are pretty uniquely Vermont. I know, I think that we're pretty special, as everyone here does as well, I'm sure, but we have some unique needs as a small rural state with a shrinking workforce and a shrinking budget and a declining population. We're not the only state in the nation that faces those, but I think we can be a laboratory for how to figure it out, for how to get it right, and for how to build that landing pad so a generation can stay here, can come back to Vermont, but also making sure that from cradle to grave, we have a support system and plan in place for Vermonters to really thrive. So I'll just say on Monday, I will be releasing the findings from my Recover Stronger tour. I spent a day per week in a different county in the state. It's been the most informative time I have spent as Lieutenant Governor, listening, learning, engaging. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm so glad that you're also going through a process of thinking about the future. I'd love to hear what you come up with. But on Monday at 1 o'clock, I'll be releasing the top 5 things I've heard from Vermonters. So I'll give you all a sneak peek. Workforce development, without question, access to housing in Vermont, access to broadband, particularly in the Northeast Kingdom and in our rural parts of the state, but a real focus on telehealth and telemedicine, which we've seen a lack of access be particularly problematic throughout this pandemic. Access to childcare and support services for families, because we've seen so many people leaving the workforce and disproportionately in Vermont because of a lack of access to childcare. And then mental health with an emphasis on young people. Our hospitals, our designated agencies have been completely overwhelmed by the number of kids coming in and needing care. And all of that is very much linked back to the workforce challenges, which I think is our greatest challenge and our greatest opportunity. So those are some of the big priorities that I see for Vermont. I welcome you to join us on Monday. We'll obviously be sharing the report, but I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to answer any questions you have. And I just want to thank you and celebrate everyone here today for coming together to think about the future, because this is our moment for Vermont. And despite the challenges, I am hopeful. I feel a lot of tempered excitement about what's to come and really look forward to working with all of you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for that. I'm seeing lots of virtual applause. Thank you for that. I'm just going to take this opportunity to mention the Collaborative's COVID Recovery Action Plan. And I'm struck by how closely the priorities that we've identified in the NEK correspond with your Recover Stronger priorities. So it's good to know that everyone is coming to some of the same priorities. So thank you for that. There's a question here from Hugh Bradshaw. Lack of affordable quality childcare is keeping many parents home, as you noted. Have there been any discussions about a state-run childcare system, perhaps tied to the K through 12 school system?
I think it's a wonderful idea. There's no bad ideas right now when it comes to thinking about one, saving access to our small rural schools, and then using a lot of the infrastructure that we have to provide access to childcare. I think it's a no-brainer, frankly. I'm sometimes wonder why we limit it to childcare access, where we also have a lot of older Vermonters who may need support or want activities or opportunities to engage with the community during the day. So really thinking about what do we have? What kind of investments can we make? And whether there is, I believe that there is a role of the state. I'm a human rights lawyer by training, that we have responsibility to make sure childcare is accessible and affordable in Vermont, but really thinking about from cradle to grave what we have and how we can utilize some of the infrastructure with really strong investments. But I do want to mention one thing: the cost of childcare at $20,000 a year in Vermont. It's just, it's wild. I mean, I don't even know how to explain like how much of an impact that has on families being able to stay in the workforce. There's so many stories I've heard again and again and again, particularly coming from women, fathers too, mothers and fathers collectively having to leave because it's just not possible, especially with cases going up and down, not knowing when kids are going to get sick, kids coming out of the classroom, obviously, and having to be at home. And I think the Build Back Better agenda, on top of some of the measures we put in place here in Vermont last year, ensuring that childcare is no more than 7% of income, which still feels like a lot. But right now, I mean, for some Vermonters, $20,000, that's 50% of income. I mean, it's just not sustainable. So it's a priority. And I love the idea of looking at our schools and figuring out, is there a way to tack on childcare into our public school system, expanding pre-K?
Thank you for that. We're not seeing any other questions in the chat, so I'll just encourage all of the participants again to put any questions in that you have. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask another one. When we do our cross-sector convenings in the NEK, one of the things that I've noted the most is the interconnectedness of all the issues. We'll be in a housing convening and people will branch off to talk about workforce challenges because they're so interconnected. Childcare and workforce, transportation, and everything. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts. There's so many wonderful people on this call in the NEK across Vermont, working in all of those sectors to really try to find good solutions for Vermonters. What's your thought about ways that we can all work together to promote those cross-sector opportunities and address that interconnectedness?
Yeah. I mean, I think in many ways, with every good question, there's an answer in the question. And I think your question is really perfect in recognizing the intersectionality. We can't talk about housing without talking about water and wastewater and sewage, the landing pad, right? The infrastructure that's needed to build. We can't talk about building without talking about, well, actually, where is our workforce coming from to help build in Vermont? And then where are we building and how are we building? I love the Lamoille Housing Project partnership. I was there recently, and the executive director said, Molly, we're building community and not sprawl. But thinking about a climate resilience plan, thinking about where we're building, how we're building, where is the transportation that's accessible for Vermonters that may be moving into our downtowns. Bennington is such a beautiful example where young professionals have come together with community leaders to do the Putnam Block project, renovating downtown buildings, ensuring that childcare is locally accessible, but really thinking about all those different pieces. So as we build these landing pads for Vermonters across the state, that we have a plan that's really sustainable and looking to the future. So I think that this isn't a moment to be siloed. It's a moment to be deeply collaborative and really breaking down the sectors that we have to create more communication, dialogue. And frankly, it comes back to innovation, entrepreneurship, which we're really good at as Vermonters. We are. I think it's part of who we are and to be deep problem solvers. So
Great. Thank you. We did get question/comment in the chat. Responsibility for access needs to include transportation. And that's a particular issue is in the NEK, as you know, young Vermonters and old. It's across the age spectrum. Do you have any thoughts on that, rural transportation, and how we can best address it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's some positive things in the infrastructure package that was just passed. Vermont obviously has a pretty strong focus on electric vehicles right now, and Vermont will be part of a national network, which I think is great. There's a lot of funding for roads and bridges. But what we still don't see is, like, what does it mean to have more buses or different locally accessible transportation? What does it look like in Orange County? I'm trying to think of in Newberry. I mean, I don't know what we would do if if I needed to get from point A to point B. It just doesn't exist. And so trying to look at our communities across the state, I think there is a pretty big and significant link to access to broadband. We have more and more Vermonters working from home, wanting to work from home. We have a lot of older folks, younger folks, I mean, just people in general who don't want to have to drive 2.5 hours for a checkup up at Newport, at the hospital, or down in Dartmouth Hitchcock, for example. If we can make sure that telehealth is fully reimbursable, that all Vermonters have access to not only a device, but either cellular service or fiber to the home, to really meet those immediate needs. I think that there's a transportation question, but how can we also make sure that we're not getting in the car and driving when we don't need to? I think that's a real equity issue, but it also has to be part of our thinking about climate mitigation, a climate resilient plan for Vermont.
Great, thank you. I'm so glad to see a little bit more action in the chat, so to speak. We have some folks with very specific recommendations about programs. So what we're going to do is we're going to save that, and we're going to make sure that you get people's suggestions and recommendations after we're done here.
Yeah.
Can you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted, there was a comment in the chat about electric vehicles and equity. And I want to be really clear that I'm not suggesting that electric vehicles are the answer to transportation access in Vermont. I think the equity issue is really around, if we're going to address climate action and making sure that all Vermonters can participate, we have to figure out how to make sure all Vermonters who want to access an electric vehicle can access an electric vehicle. But that is a separate question, and Sylvia is absolutely right. Then what does it mean to have access to transportation in rural communities in the state, whether it's electric or not? And so I want to recognize I get that, and thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. We have another question from Kim. Can you talk a little bit more about programs to address the diminishing workforce?
Yes. I don't think there's one simple solution. I know that Vermont got a lot of attention for the $10,000 Move to Vermont program. And it's not to say that that didn't bring some positive focus, but I really think our workforce development strategy has to get back to and derive from the workforce we need. We have a palpable, painful, challenging lack of home care providers, nurses. We have not enough mental health and support service providers. And the part of the crisis that we see around kids coming into different hospitals, our emergency rooms are packed with people who have a mental health crisis. And part of it is we don't have enough space. Something's happening in the state, I think, related to the pandemic in terms of need, but we don't have enough people to meet the need. And so when we think about addressing our workforce challenges, I think we need to look at who do we need and then designing programs around that need. I know it sounds really basic, but the wide net, come one, come all, isn't meeting the need that we have. So I think it's tuition reimbursement. I think it's incentivizing graduates to go to CCV, if we're coming out of our vocational and technical centers or state colleges, to know that there's a job right here, right now for you in Vermont, that we have, as I said, tuition reimbursement, there's incentive programs to stay in the state, but we can't just incentivize staying in Vermont and getting a job here, because I'll tell you, I was down in Rutland yesterday, and there are nurses that are signing contracts at Rutland Region Medical Center but they can't find any housing. And so then ultimately aren't coming to the state. So it's building that landing pad around housing, around childcare, to make sure not only are we recruiting and retaining the people that we need in the workforce in certain jobs, but having the infrastructure in place to say, Vermont is your home now and you can succeed here.
Great, thank you. Speaking of childcare and young Vermonters, we also have a question about a very specific program. The Dolly Parton, I want to make sure that I use the correct title. The Dolly Parton Imagination Library Program. I have heard of it in other states. It's starting here in Vermont, and Dolly Parton did start it in Tennessee, and it's all about mailing a book a month to our youngest Vermonters to instill that love of reading from a very early age, particularly in households that might not have the funds for a lot of books in the home. Have you heard of that program? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Senator Brian Campion down in Bennington has done a lot of work with this. I think it's a wonderful program. I know he's the chair of the Senate Education Committee, and we've been talking about how could we incentivize this program and sort of making it more of a statewide program. I think it's terrific, especially now we have so many kids on cell phones and electronics, and just the importance of sort of taking a moment and sitting down with a book and reading. I think we all need it. I need it, but especially our young people, and making sure that every child has access to a good book.
Good, thank you. We also have a comment from Heidi Krantz from the Vermont Small Business Development Center about the difficulty of finding and retaining employees, and just her thoughts on that. So just wanted to make sure that you saw that as well.
Yes, I'd see the living wage. It's so important. I think 2 years ago, we were talking about a $15 minimum wage. No question, Vermonters see the $15 minimum wage. But right now, I hear countless stories of childcare providers saying, well, I'm getting $14.25 as an early childhood educator when Dunkin' Donuts is willing to pay $17 an hour. And I think we all probably have heard stories like that. And it really comes back to if we value these jobs and this workforce in our communities, what are we going to do to make it a valued profession? And that starts with having a salary that allows our most valued and some of our most essential workers to live and work and thrive in Vermont.
Absolutely. We do unfortunately have to wrap this up, but please keep putting comments in the chat until we're absolutely done. We will make sure that Lieutenant Governor Gray gets those. In light of the fact, though, that we have talked a lot about attracting younger people to Vermont, I'm going to take the liberty of giving our awesome Vista volunteer the last word on this and the last question, if I could. And his question is, recognizing the interconnectedness of these issues, do you see any one of these areas as foundational to enacting change? What's the most impactful area to start?
I don't want to say it's an issue. I actually want to say it's the process by which we come to a plan. And for me, it's exactly what you're doing here today. It's getting as many Vermonters from as many communities as possible engaged in the public community discussions about how to spend the ARPA funds, getting as many Vermonters and communities, everyone here today, into the State House as the conversations happen about how we narrow those buckets and define how we're going to spend the ARPA funds, but being really focused in our vision, right? It's housing, it's workforce development, it's equity and access to broadband, it's childcare and paid family and medical leave. It's the landing pad. And let's put those issues on the landing pad and make sure that we're really focused, because ultimately, I think that's what's going to grow our workforce, but also make sure that every Vermonter can live and thrive in Vermont. And ultimately, I believe in my heart of hearts that if we figure this out, we'll be a model for the nation on how to get it right. Rural Vermont will be a model for rural America. So thank you so much for having me. I want to say this sincerely. Please reach out. My office is your office. I'm your Lieutenant Governor, but I'm Molly Gray from Newbury, Vermont, and I get it. And I want to figure this out, and I want to figure it out with you. So Please be in touch. Please stay in touch. And I really look forward to reading whatever outcomes come out of today. And we'll certainly look at the action plan that you developed. So thanks, and have
Thank
a
you.
terrific day and a good weekend. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.